Hi, I'm Doug Hocking, and I have written this book, Terror on the Santa Fe Trail, Kit Carson and the Jicarilla Apache. The book has won the Will Rogers Medallion, um, the Co Founders Award from Westerners International, and was a Spur finalist. A while back, someone invited me to do a book reading. Now, I've never known an author that actually did a book reading. Uh, Maybe they do that in New York City, but this sure ain't New York. So I thought I'd better practice. And I did. And I liked what I heard so much that I bought a copy. Anyway, a reading from Terror on the Santa Fe Trail. The soldiers are coming up Ojo Caliente Canyon at 8,000 feet. Uh, and here's where it starts. As an eerie cry echoed high above the soldiers like an eagle or a Valkyrie, First Sergeant Holbrook turned in the saddle and called out, "Look out, men. That's the war whoop. And now we've got to fight. We're in it now." The sergeant glanced at his watch, an old habit from writing military reports. It was 8 a.m. Further back in the column, Private Strobridge heard the strange cry and swiveled his head from side to side, then looked above, expecting an attack from the sky. Beside him, an old soldier smirked grimly. "Better cap your piece, lad." He turned in his saddle and spoke to those behind as he reached into his pouch for a percussion cap. "Cap your pieces, lads. We're in for it." Private Marr vividly recalled that in the next few moments, as a man dressed like an Indian stepped out on the ridge above and beckoned with his hand, saying, in as good English as I could speak, "Come on, we're ready for you." I had the impression at the time that the man who said "come on," etc., was a white man. But when Marr turned to the man beside him, Private Null, to ask him to confirm what the man had said, Null reported having seen and heard nothing. At the head of the column, Lieutenant Davidson barked orders to advance up the slope toward the Jicarilla camp, and the soldiers spurred their horses. Any semblance of order soon broke down as they dodged to and fro among the trees, and his horses slid backward, knocking those beside and behind askew. Lieutenant Davidson gave the order to dismount, and the men continued up the hill, drawing their mounts by the reins until the horses refused to go any further. The lieutenant then gave the order to the men to turn their steeds over to the number fours, the horse holders. Leaving the surgeon behind in charge of a fourth of his command, Davidson divided his men into two platoons, led by Sergeants Holbrook and Kent. They advanced as skirmishers, spread out in loose order and not as a compact force. On the lieutenant's right, Sergeant Kent ordered his men forward. The two columns advanced, soon losing cohesion and sight of each other in the pine forest. The men, although in good shape, gasped and staggered and stopped to catch breath. Finally, some of the soldiers arrived on level ground crowded with conical teepees of the Jicarilla. Small fires smoldered here and there. An old couple sat grinning by the entrance to a lodge. No one else was in sight. Then, somewhere in the camp, a shot rang out. A brief flurry of shots followed. Sergeant Kent fell dead at the feet of his men. They raised their weapons and fired on the only targets in sight, the old man and woman sitting peacefully by a teepee. The firing stopped briefly. From the depths of the canyon, Dr. Magruder's cry was heard. "They're stealing the horses!" Lieutenant Davidson responded instantly, leading his men down the hillside, back to the horse holders. He signaled to the sergeants leading his platoons and noticed that Kent was down. "Leave him. We'll come back for him." The men tumbled and leapt down the hillside as Apaches fired guns and arrows from hidden positions along their flanks. Beside Bronson, a man fell, the feathers of an arrow protruding from his chest, the point from his back. Bronson thought him dead. Beside him, another man called out, "Leave him." In the hollow, where they had left the horses, the lieutenant gave instructions while the doctor tended to the wounded. He had his men form a circle around the number fours, who continued to hold the remaining horses. A horse stricken by an arrow high in the neck screamed, reared, and fell dead. Lieutenant Bell would later write, "This was the most unmilitary as well as the most exposed order possible. It could not be expected that a display of numbers would intimidate the Indians, while a large mark was thus presented to their concentrated fire. This is no labored scientific deduction. A non-commissioned officer who would not have appreciated it upon the ground should have been reduced for incapacity." Far from having been ambushed, Lieutenant Davidson conducted an attack on a peaceful camp on ground and manner highly unfavorable to success. The Jicarilla defended themselves. Lieutenant Bell wrote further, "Now was to be fulfilled the prediction about wiping them out. It is at least doubtful who fired first, but what matters it? Was not the advance upon the camp in a hostile attitude a bona fide attack?" Holbrook and the sergeant from F Troop went about calming the men, telling them, "Don't fire until you're sure of your target. Save your ammunition. We've only got what you're carrying." On the up canyon side, there was a sudden activity. Indians darted from tree to tree. The soldiers fired and then scrambled to reload in the haze of sulphurous, stinking, eye-burning smoke. The Apaches had charged, moving closer while the soldiers reloaded, and then they disappeared again into hollows in the ground behind the trees. Suddenly, they were darting from tree to tree again. Now and then a triumphant trooper would cry out, "I hit one! Did you see him fall?" In response, a dozen musketoons would fire, and the smoke would grow thick between the trees, further concealing the Apache. Out among the trees and haze, an unscathed warrior would crawl away unseen to a new position. The soldiers thought they had killed many, but only 2 Apaches died that day. Trooper Strobridge spoke of his lieutenant's courage in this tight spot, and of a vocal exchange with the surgeon. Crouched behind cover of fallen trees, Dr. Magruder tended the wounded. He called out to the lieutenant, "Davidson, for God's sake, get down. You're making yourself a target." "Doctor, I'm doing what my duty demands." Lieutenant Bell says that he panicked and cried out, "Mountains, save yourselves!" Soon after, he regained his composure because, although frightened, the men stopped at least briefly at the knoll. And seeing the men in the rear in difficulty, Davidson ran back and directed a rearguard action to slow the enemy while his dragoons escaped to the hill. He and a handful of dragoons charged the Apache and drove them back. Finding the position entirely dominated, there was higher ground within range of Jicarilla weapons all around. The unit continued up the far wall of the canyon. Half a mile to the north and hundreds of feet above the men on the knoll was a saddle leading to Tierra Amarilla Canyon. Lieutenant Davidson led his men up the hill. They were a ragtag bunch. Some were mounted on horses. A well man behind one that was wounded, holding his fellow in the saddle. Others were on foot, many bleeding, clinging to saddle straps, hoping the horse would drag them up the hill. Still others tried to drag horses up the slope by the reins. A few clung to their musketoons. Halfway up the hill, gasping for breath and thin air, Lieutenant Davidson halted. Dr. Magruder continued to advance up the hill. The lieutenant called out, "Doctor, stay with the command." Magruder continued his climb, seeming not to notice, and some of the men went with him. The lieutenant called out again, "Halt!" And the two companies came to a halt to catch their breath. The doctor continued on his way. "Doctor, for God's sake, halt!" The doctor finally paused in his climb. "Doctor, I've lost some of my non-commissioned men, and I have no other officers. Will you help me to take charge of these men?" He nodded that he would. Halting to catch his breath, Lieutenant Davison noticed that the Apache were also climbing the canyon side to his right and left. They were taking the high ground above the saddle. They hadn't gone far before the Hickorea attacked again. Strobridge's horse fell dead almost on top of him. He started to remove saddle and tack from the horse's body as he had been taught, but his sergeant ordered him to leave it. Private Newhand squatted beside Strobridge, seeking cover behind a tree. A bullet passed through both his legs as he squatted there. Arrows fell around the soldiers like rain. The ground was covered as if it had snowed arrows. The trees looked like hedgehogs. Lieutenant Davidson was hit, but continued in command, ignoring his pain. Strobridge looked up and saw an arrow protruding from his officer's back. To find out the rest of what happened to this unfortunate command, you'll have to read the book. Its history, everything that was said was reported later by the soldiers. It's in their words. The description comes from them. The book is available on Amazon and at DougHawking.com. If you order from DougHawking.com, you get a signed copy. Thanks, and have a great day.